Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about a very recent tragedy that took place in the Alps. My channel has plenty of videos about mountaineers who abandoned their weakened companions in the mountains to die while descending on their own. Those incidents sparked a lot of outrage in the media and in the comments under my videos, but often, the people who left their partners behind faced no punishment. However, the case we're discussing today is unique because it ended up in court. Let's start from the beginning as usual. On January 18, 2025, 36-year-old Thomas Plamberger and his 33-year-old girlfriend, Kirsten Grutner, attempted a technically challenging winter climb on Grossglockner, the highest peak in Austria at 3,798 meters. The next morning, Plamberger safely descended from the mountain, but his partner was still lying 30 meters from the summit. She was too weak to come down on her own. Plamberger claims he left her to seek help, but by the time rescuers reached the woman, she had already frozen to death. The prosecutor's office in Innsbruck launched an investigation and charged Plamberger with negligent homicide, facing up to 3 years in prison. The trial is still ongoing, so everything I'm saying here is just my assumptions and speculations. So what really happened? Let's figure it out. According to the lawyer, the climbers were sufficiently experienced, properly prepared, and well-equipped. In reality, though, Kirsten had never climbed to such heights or tackled routes of this difficulty level. She was clearly much less experienced as a mountaineer than her boyfriend. Apparently, she just trusted her romantic partner. They started the ascent at 6:45 a.m., aiming to conquer the summit via the southwest ridge, known as the Stuttlegrat. This is a route of about the 5th difficulty category. It's chosen only by seasoned climbers or clients accompanied by a professional guide. Overall, it's a 6-kilometer path that includes a kilometer of rock climbing with an especially tough technical final section. Typically, the Stuttlegrat route is done by guides with clients over 2 days. This trail is most often selected for summer ascents, and in winter, it's rarely attempted due to the complexity and harsh weather conditions. But back to our climbers. They planned to return via an easier route descending southeast through Austria's third highest peak, Kleinglockner, at 3,770 meters. Then, they intended to pass through the Erzherzog Johann mountain hut at 3,454 meters. If the climb dragged on, the hut could serve as their overnight spot. So, at 1:30 p.m., the climbers reached a spot known as the Breakfast Place at 3,550 meters. This is a popular rest point on the ridge, with 300 meters left to the summit. It seems close, but after that comes the most technically demanding part of the path. This point acts as a sort of turnaround spot. Climbers assess the weather, their strength, the snow quality, and decide whether to continue or better turn back and descend. Further on the rocky sections, turning around would be much harder. In the morning of the ascent day, the sun was shining, but by afternoon, the wind picked up and the temperature started dropping. These were signs that the weather conditions could get much worse later. But the tourists ignored this fact. As I mentioned, they were there at 1:30 p.m., which is late for such a route. It was already clear they wouldn't complete it before dark. In the defense's statements, it said that since neither the woman nor Plamberger were exhausted or downcast, they continued on. However, this ascent dragged on significantly. It usually takes just 7 hours, but at 10:30 p.m., they still hadn't reached the summit. Night had already fallen, and ahead of them was the toughest ridge section, which they had to navigate in the dark. Most likely, they decided it would be safer to cross over the mountain and spend the night in the high-altitude hut. That would be better than descending the snowy and dangerous ridge in the dark. Rescuers in the valley observed the points of light from the climbers' headlamps moving along the mountain slope and even took several photos that later went viral. It seemed nothing unusual was happening, but in the evening, the weather changed sharply. Wind speeds reached 72 kilometers per hour, and the temperature, accounting for wind, was minus 20 degrees Celsius. Rescuers below recorded the strengthening wind, and at 10:30 p.m., a helicopter from the Mountain Rescue Service was dispatched to assist the pair. But when it flew over them and illuminated them with spotlights, Thomas showed no signs of distress, and the pair simply continued the ascent. His lawyer says that, at that moment, there was no emergency situation. Both felt fine, the summit was already close, and they had no reason to interrupt the climb. However, the weather kept worsening, and 2 hours later, the helicopter returned. The helicopter crew directed light at the pair, but again received no signal indicating they were in trouble. The pair continued the ascent. This was the last time the helicopter could take off that day. And according to the defense, as soon as the helicopter flew away, the woman's condition deteriorated sharply. She suddenly began showing signs of severe exhaustion. Her condition worsened right before his eyes. Plamberger says this was sudden and couldn't be predicted. The prosecution notes that the mountain rescue services made several attempts to contact Thomas after the helicopter flew over them, to which he didn't respond, although he had communication and was receiving calls. The first call from Plamberger to rescuers came only at 0:35. His speech was incoherent, and it was impossible to understand what he was saying. After that, Plamberger put the phone in his pocket and for some reason set it to silent mode. The climber himself claims he was sure that rescuers were already rushing to their aid. They continued to climb slowly to the summit. To avoid freezing, they decided to keep moving, and 30 meters from the summit, the woman completely ran out of strength. She lay down on the snow, and Thomas sat next to her. They spent an hour and a half like that, according to the climber, waiting for the rescue helicopter. However, it soon became clear to them that no one would come for them. The wind was too strong, and as Plamberger says, they jointly decided that the best option would be for him to go alone to the mountain hut, where, as they knew, 2 climbers were spending the night. And then, together with the climbers, they would return and carry Kirsten to warmth. And as you understand, we can't verify if this was a joint decision or if Thomas simply decided to abandon the woman on the mountain slope, since we only have his version of events. But in his testimony, there's one major inconsistency. For an hour and a half, they wait for the rescue helicopter, freezing and obviously in need of help. And all this time, Plamberger has a phone with connection in his pocket. Moreover, rescuers are constantly calling this phone, and for some reason, Thomas doesn't answer. He set the phone to silent and simply ignored their calls. Furthermore, when leaving his partner in a very poor condition, he also doesn't try to call the rescue service. Although, I repeat, he had that opportunity all along. He left her around 2 a.m., and approximately at 3:40 a.m. on January 19th, he reaches the mountain refuge Adlerruhe at 3,451 meters. However, he didn't go back for his girlfriend, but first called the rescue service and reported that he had left the exhausted woman to spend the night on the mountain in hurricane winds at -20. He made the call around 3:30 a.m. Only then did the rescuers learn that help was needed. By that time, the storm was so strong that a helicopter rescue operation was out of the question. The weather didn't allow takeoff. Then, rescuers set out to the victim on foot. At night, in the storm, along a very difficult route, they made their way to the woman, but reached her only at 10 a.m. and found that she had frozen to death. The prosecution seized the climbers' mobile phones and sports watches, interviewed several witnesses, and studied photos and video recordings of the incident. The charge ultimately brought against him is manslaughter by gross negligence. This is more severe than involuntary manslaughter or simple negligent homicide. It's one of the harshest charges that can be brought in connection with another person's death. The Austrian prosecution explains that for this, there must be almost indifferent disregard for basic safety rules, and the danger to life must be obvious and predictable. Another example of manslaughter by gross negligence is, for instance, driving under the influence of alcohol resulting in a person's death. The prosecution claims that Plamberger made 9 separate mistakes that collectively led to this tragedy. First, he took Kirsten as his partner. Despite the woman's inexperience, she had never undertaken high-altitude hikes of such duration and difficulty category and had never climbed to such heights, especially in winter conditions. The prosecution states that Thomas was the leader of this expedition. The defense insists that they were equal team members with the same experience. The prosecution also claims that the pair started the ascent at least 2 hours later than the safe time, lacked sufficient emergency equipment, and didn't turn back in time when they realized the weather was worsening. The prosecution also points out that Plamberger didn't call the emergency service, although he had the opportunity all along. They also add that Plamberger made Grutner climb in soft snowboard boots. She brought a split board for the descent from the mountain, but this footwear was unsuitable for mixed descents in winter conditions. And evidence of gross negligence is also the fact that he didn't signal distress when the rescue helicopter flew over them. Then he set his phone to silent mode and ignored rescuers' calls. And finally, before leaving her at the summit at 2 a.m., Thomas Plamberger didn't move his girlfriend to a sheltered spot to at least protect her from the wind and heat loss. He didn't even wrap her in a sleeping bag, although they had 2 sleeping bags. They also had rescue blankets that could help her survive the night and not freeze. However, no attempts were made to warm her. Moreover, during the ascent, he didn't remove her heavy backpack and splitboard to lighten her load and speed up the pace. Mountain guide Peter Suttner, who has done this route more than 200 times, commented on it this way: "If you're not a professional mountaineer, choosing the Stuttlegart route for ascent in winter is only possible with a guide. If a guide sees that you're not in ideal shape in terms of mountaineering skills, experience, or physical condition, he will definitely refuse such an ascent. Also, a climber must stop the ascent if half the route, including the most difficult section before the summit, will be done at night. As for me, I would leave a person there only if I was sure that I or the rescue team would return to him within an hour." Argentine mountaineer Damian Benegas, who has led expeditions around the world for over 30 years, commented this way: "Experienced mountaineers often descend alone for help. It's difficult for one person to descend mountainous terrain carrying the weight of another person. But the real mistake started before that moment, when he decided to take her on this technically difficult route, when they decided to leave late, knowing the weather was bad, when they didn't turn back, and so on and so on. The most incriminating moment for me in Plamberger's story is that he doesn't describe the events that occurred between 1 p.m., when they decided to continue the climb from the turnaround point at 3,550 meters, and 10:30 p.m., which is 9 hours of ascent about which we know nothing. He also skips the second interval 5 hours after sunset, when they were still climbing but ignored the helicopter sent to help them. The fact that Plamberger waved off the helicopter, which he doesn't deny, is practically impossible to justify. They were clearly in trouble. Plamberger's claim that everything was fine until then, but right after the helicopter flew away, the woman, quote, suddenly began showing increasingly escalating signs of exhaustion. This was completely unexpected and objectively unpredictable. All this sounds quite absurd. And the fact that he didn't call rescuers, if they prove he had signal, then how will he defend himself? "I see no arguments in his favor," says the mountaineer. The guide also states that the incident resembles a typical case of summit fever. He says that a mountaineering team, whether guide and client, husband and wife, friends, or random partners, is as strong as its weakest member. Therefore, the responsibility lies with the more experienced mountaineer. If you have more experience and physical training, your task is not to pull the partner up to your level. Your task is to descend to his level. And there's no court decision yet. His guilt hasn't been proven, but we can still speculate. In the end, we have a couple bound by romantic relationships. And in my view, this is also a very important point. The man takes a less experienced woman on a technically difficult winter ascent, who is clearly not ready for this hike. However, instead of turning around and descending, seeing that they started too late, won't complete the track before dark, and moreover, the weather is starting to deteriorate, he still leads them on the ascent. Plus, the woman is going in unsuitable equipment with a heavy backpack and snowboard. Then they see the rescue helicopter, and the man waves it off with his hand, showing that everything is fine with them. In fact, at that moment, the situation was probably critical. And perhaps the woman herself could have signaled the helicopter, but something stopped her. Here we can only guess. Maybe it was trust in her romantic partner, maybe just insecurity in herself, or simply she no longer had the strength to signal. In general, the situation with the helicopter isn't as straightforward as it seems at first glance. The thing is, in Austria, a helicopter rescue operation isn't covered by state insurance, and without insurance, it can cost $1,000. In case of gross negligence, the rescued persons have to pay the full cost of the rescue. So you can guess that if they had been picked up from there by helicopter, they would have had to pay a hefty sum. And it seems to me that this fact could well explain why Thomas waved off the helicopter and didn't answer rescuers' calls. Perhaps he simply didn't want large financial expenses for paying for the rescue operation. But why he didn't try to warm the freezing woman, Although he had the opportunity, this question remains unanswered. They had 2 sleeping bags, 2 rescue blankets. And if she could be moved somewhere sheltered from the wind, well, behind a rock or a cliff or into some niche. And if she could be wrapped in 2 sleeping bags and 2 rescue blankets, it takes literally a few minutes, then most likely she would have sat out the night. Yes, perhaps she would have gotten frostbite, but she would have stayed alive. The temperature on the mountain wasn't lethal. It was only -10 degrees Celsius. With wind chill, it felt like -20, but that's also quite survivable if sheltered from the wind and especially wrapped in 2 sleeping bags. But Thomas leaves her just lying on the snow and goes to the warm hut. In the morning, he descends and this whole story ends. In general, there are many blind spots in this incident. We know practically nothing about how this ascent happened, except for very small snippets that Thomas tells. Perhaps after the court case, we'll learn more information. But this case definitely shows that leaving a person in the mountains doesn't always go unpunished. What do you think about all this? Write in the comments. Don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I know many watch me without subscribing. That's no good. Subscribe. It's not hard for you and it'll be nice for me. Bye everyone.